So I'm going to be talking about Koichi today. He was born in the mid-7th century and was the foremost disciple of Hsüan-tsang. And he's credited as the founder and the systematizer of the Chinese mind-only school, or the Fa-hsiang school. And he was the principal translator of the Chengwei Shirlun, or the Vision of Jimmatratta, city which Hsüan-tsang collected in India and brought back to China.
Well, of course, this is up in the air. Other possibilities are that Hsüan-tsang wrote it after coming back. As far as I know, that Hsüan-tsang might have just been translating Dharmapala's treatise. So in any case, it was a combination of texts that Hsüan-tsang himself wrote in Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing we've heard. And that, not that Koichi had anything to do with translating. And the other is that to put even more emphasis on, Hsüan-tsang, when you look, did Hopkins write this, or did 18 or however many it is, 10 or 15 Tibetan scholars write it? But anyways,
Koichi was on the translation team of the 10 treatises that he helped to translate texts that Hsüan-tsang brought from India.
Yeah, well, let's, all of us look at that carefully, whatever evidence we can find. Yeah, it's hard to say that maybe, there's a format of being humble and saying it's just material from these texts, which is what I often say about this stuff. I just wrote down what I was reading or something.
If he did work on that translation, if it was a translation, he also did exegetical, philosophical, and practical works. So he was a broad-ranging scholar in any case. And his notes to the Chengwei Shirlun, which are called the Chengwei Shirlun Shirqi, are the primary source of our interpretation of what Hsüan-tsang thought. I guess because the Chinese in the original is so terse that you need an interpretation to understand it. Well, what Spanberg believes about this Chengwei Shirlun is that it was only compiled by Hsüan-tsang and that Koichi was the editor of it. So I guess I'll have to look at his notes. And after Koichi's death, I think people say by the 9th century, the Fa-hsiang school was almost gone from China. And there are two principal reasons given for the decline. The first is that the Fa-hsiang school was just so scholastic in its focus that it was really inaccessible to ordinary Chinese people, most of whom were probably illiterate at the time. And that it really didn't appeal to their image of Buddhism as accessible to all people. And the number two reason given is that the Fa-hsiang school concentrated on this theory of the Achantaka, which are the lineage of fixed gotra of people who will never reach Buddhahood, and that also didn't fit with the popular Chinese image of the Ekayana, which was open to all beings. So it was unpopular. And also the Huayan school, which was very popular, classified the Fa-hsiang as the lowest Mahayana rung of its tenet ladder. So I'm sure that was a blow. And then it became so popular and it just disappeared. But Koichi's writings were carried to Japan and they became one of the bases for the Hosei school, which was very strong in the Nara period. And later in the 1880s, when Koichi's writings had been lost in China, Japanese scholars carried Koichi's writings back to China, and so there was a revitalization of interest in Koichi at the time, much later. So I'm going to be talking about Spanberg's interpretations of Koichi, and I used two articles of Spanberg's. The first one is the Trisvabhāva doctrine in India and China. And Spanberg talks about those first two models, and then he describes Koichi But Spanberg makes very clear his opinion that Koichi's views are closer to the earlier classical pivotal model.
Pivotal being associated with?
Well, Spanberg associates it with the classical Indian Yogacara.
Meaning
Mahasangha, I guess. Asangas.
And the progressive model?
Being this vague, maybe post-Koichi. And I also found this very juicy short article in Traditions of Meditation in Chinese Buddhism, which is a Croat Institute book. And there's, Spanberg did a whole article on the Fa-hsiang school's meditation practices. And it's really interesting. So I thought it would be good to synthesize these two ways of looking at Koichi, how he sees practice progressing and how he describes the Trisvabhāva in a more philosophical manner. So I first want to talk about this theory of Koichi's, or at least Spanberg says that it's Koichi's, Wu Cheng Wei Shi Quan, which is the 5 levels of discernment. And Spanberg's sources were Koichi's commentary on the Heart Sutra and his essay on the Vision of Dhimmachanta, which Spanberg wrote his dissertation on. These 5 levels of discernment don't describe 5 meditation practices that an individual would sit down and do, but they're rather a discussion of the more general progression that an individual would undergo in one's lifetime in a gradual realization of the Trisvabhāva. So that's why I say it's sort of in between a meditation guide and a philosophical treatise. So they're paradigmatic in nature. And the first level and the 5th levels are what are really important in that they describe the reality of the 3 natures. In the first level, Koichi says that one must realize that the imaginary nature is non-existent and that the other 2 must be preserved as real because they are real. So having set up that teaching, then he goes through 3 levels after that. The second level is a shift in focus from external objects as the dependent to seeing consciousness as a flow of perception, and within that flow to see that we are perceiving what he calls an inner intentional object and an inner perception. So that to me sounds like a distinction between a subject-object within our cognition, that we should see that we're perceiving cognition in that way. And that we should see that the mistake is to allow that inner intentional object to be diffused into what we think are external objects. So it's a confusion of this internal object and what we're perceiving as external. And then the 2nd and 3rd levels are talking about this scholastic Yogacara doctrine of a sense of consciousness that's unbifurcated. He doesn't give any very detailed description of what that is. He calls it unbifurcated consciousness, or cognition, sorry. So I guess this is the source of what arises as perceiver and perceived within consciousness, that it's non-dual. So by the 4th level, you're realizing that, and that all specific mental states are just arising out of that. That's the base consciousness. And then in the 5th level, he sort of returns back to the 1st, or he describes the practitioner as returning to the 1st. And the 5th level says at the stage that one realizes the contemplation of thusness, which is the consummate, as Spanberg translates it, conventional particulars are made evident as they truly are by understanding the universal of thusness. So he's returning back into phenomenological existence, I guess, or phenomenal existence. And it is precisely this that is the essence of what was contemplated at the 1st level. So it's a circular progression. And then to go on to this article Trisvabhāva doctrine. I gave you this chart, and you can see that Spanberg is putting the dependent in what he calls a medial relationship between the other two. And this is possible because of Hsüan-tsang's or Koichi's viewing the dependent as having two aspects, one defiled and one pure. So if you see the line underneath the chart which says progression of practice, according to Koichi, one would move from being absorbed in viewing what we perceive as an external world as our imagined constructs. You move from being absorbed in that to realizing thusness, which is the consummate. So it's like moving from the imaginary to the consummate. And it's the focus on this consummate that brings the initial liberation, according to Spanberg. So the later commentators and scholars that I suppose make up this progressive model, they take this quote from Koichi in talking about this progression, and they stop quoting him at that point, so that they see the whole of Koichi's view of the progression as ending with realizing the consummate. So in the triangle there. But Spanberg says that there's more to this passage if you go back to Koichi's writings. And to explain this last step, Koichi uses this idea that there are these two moments. And I went back to see if Spanberg is more specific about quote-unquote enlightenment, and he's not in this article. So I don't know
More
what
specific about what enlightenment?
Quote-unquote enlightenment.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thought that was a special kind of enlightenment.
Quote-unquote enlightenment.
Quote-unquote enlightenment.
But there are Sanskrit terms. Samyak, which is perfect, and that what is subsequent to that is Prishtalabha Jnana.
Yeah, these are famous terms for, being in meditative equipoise, realizing emptiness, and then rising. You don't have to stand up or anything, but paying attention to phenomena, the state subsequent to meditative equipoise. And Buddhahood is, in the material I know, is when you have these two simultaneously, when they don't alternate anymore.
So maybe when they're still subsequent, that's just an initial realization.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, it's the second moment of cognition that brings the practitioner back into viewing the dependent nature in its pure aspect. So the way I saw it is, instead of just seeing the purity of the dependent, you're seeing the dependent in its pure aspect. So if we go back to the other two models and compare it with this one, in both Koichi's model in Spanberg's model of Koichi and the pivotal, the dependent nature remains sort of an ontological basis for the other two. The other two are just aspects of it. And this is in juxtaposition with the third, in which the consummate nature transcends the imaginary and the dependent. They're both dismissed. But in contrast to the pivotal, this model of Koichi's thought, the imaginary and the consummate are not really epistemic. They're not views of the dependent, but rather aspects of it. So this is all sort of on one level as an ontological description.
Good job.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought I might have to say a little bit about Hsüan-tsang. By the time he was around, Buddhism has come to China for about 600 years, and it is said that his Sanskrit was very good, and he wasn't convinced with a lot of translations that he saw. So he wanted to go to India to find the original to all those texts that he has been reading when he was in China. And the first focus he wanted to get is Yogacara Bhumi Shastra. And he was able to meet Shilabhadra, who is disciple of Dhammapala. And Shilabhadra was 106 by that time. So anyway, eventually he did meet Hsüan-tsang, and then Shilabhadra. Oh yeah, by the way, there's in Chinese Indian Buddhist scholarly circle. They seem to divide up the Indian Buddhism into existence and the emptiness school. So emptiness school is what Nagarjuna in that system they have, and whereas the existence school is like Yogacara.
That's how Onchuk, what he calls it, non-existence. And the first turning he calls existence.
The first turning,
Whereas Tsongpa, as you know, calls it Rangitseniki Truba, or Ranzidovi Shenshi Rangitseniki Truba.
The first turning, when I was reading all the material, they were only talking about the second and the third, and I only remember they talk about the first as laying down the four truths.
Right? Way of doctrine of the four truths.
And then it's like the Yogacara school would say the third wheel is the definitive, in order to assert some existence, to avoid badly taking emptiness for the general population, because they might easily misunderstand what's presented in Miniyamaka. That's why they want to take a sutra unraveling of thought and lay down three natures and three non-natures. So tell people there are certain things that exist. For example, our karma, and so on and so on. So anyway, that was the two camps.
That's a bit like Gelugpa, right? In which it's saying that for Yogacara, the second wheel of the doctrine requires interpretation only in its literal reading. In terms of what it actually teaches, it doesn't require interpretation.
Hsüan-tsang himself does not like this kind of divisions. He considers what the Buddha said should be all consistent. That's why he wrote Hui Zong Lun, literally means integration of schools, to express the final goal for the two schools to be the same. And this work did not survive either in India or in China. It's only from his disciples' account of what he did in India, and then people took a guess about what he would have written in there. Now, there are three systems in the Chinese mind-only schools. The one system is Hsüan-tsang's system, where they pass down for only 4 generations. The heads of these 4 generations are Hsüan-tsang, Koichi, Huizhao, Zhizhou. And Koichi, Huizhao, Zhizhou, they each did a lot of commentary on Hsüan-tsang's Chengwei Shilun in order to, because everything is all terse, they got to interpret further what is said there. And they follow Dhammapala's tradition and what's considered to be the orthodox Chinese mind-only school. And the other system is Yuan-Ce's system. Wangchuk is the Korean pronunciation. And Yuan-Ce's work, as taking Chengwei Shilun, that's what probably Tsongpa refers to as the treatise. Gyana Zhouqin, yeah. And they were the proponents of Paramatta's translation of Shi Da Sheng Lun, Summary of the Great Vehicle, written by a Sangha. And Paramatta came to China around the 6th century. The third system in the Chinese mind-only is Shi Di Jing Lun, commentators of Shi Di Jing Lun, treatise on the 10 grounds sutra, compiled by Buswell. And this school is never quite talked about somehow. Anyway, the Chinese mind-only school are the proponents of the Indian existence school. Is attributed to Dhammapala, and whose major opponent was his contemporary, Baba Viveka. Baba Viveka's non-existence of all phenomena negates all 3 natures of the Yogacara school. Chapter 8 of Chengwei Shilun has the following. Imputational natures has no substantial existence. There are both substantial and imputed existence in the other part nature. Thoroughly established natures are substantial existence only. The three non-natures are established to delineate that all phenomena are natureless, as said in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra and so on.
Page 331
Three.
for the substantial existence reference. And that's not the main place where substantial existence is talked about, but on what you're talking about, it's right here. And there's a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra that speaks this way, and my guess is that and it's something that Tsong was rejecting what he considers to be a wrong interpretation in India. And my guess is that he would reject this Chinese interpretation. And it would be how you put the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and the Sutra Unraveling the Thought together. And that's what Tsongkhapa is objecting to and what we have here is Giant Sheva's summation of that argument, which Tsongkhapa presents in detail later in the in Lexing. Now, your other question was where
Tsongkhapa says that liberation from karma and cyclic existence can be achieved within what's said in Perfection of Wisdom Sutra and Treatise on the Meadow. Then whatever is said in those two things should be the ultimate alternative.
Yes. Where he's chiding Tibetan Madhyamakas. This is, yes, page 327. And he concludes it, he says, you Tibetans who are claiming to be, this is in the translation, you Tibetans who are claiming to be Madhyamakas are holding a position actually of nihilism. Therefore, it would be splendid if you relied on this mode of commentary by the yogic practitioners. You know, you'd be a lot better off. Okay.
So based on Tsongkhapa's this very point, Yin Sun sees that this proves that Yogacara and Madhyamaka can coexist.
Yeah.
That way.
Through this route, yes. Which Tsongkhapa doesn't approve of, but who cares? In one way. It's either Shakya Chokden, you know, George was speaking about two Sakya scholars, but more or less renegade, Shakya Chokden and Koramba Sunam Sengye. It's one of those two who holds that there's Tangdönki Ngedön and Ngedönki Ngedön. I mean, it sounds like a contradiction of terms. And when this was brought up in Graz last summer, even somebody like Roeg was amazed that somebody would think this. But now, the Ngedönki Ngedön is the third wheel, with the Sutra Unraveling the Thought and so forth. The Tangdönki Ngedön is the middle wheel, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Because on the literal level they require interpretation, but what is actually being taught, which is called the Ngöden or the Ngöki Joja. Ngöki Joja means what is explicitly being spoken. So there's a difference between what's literally being spoken and what's explicitly being spoken.
So explicit teaching is in context. The teaching with its context.
Yes, with its context.
What is intended?
Another
way of saying it?
Yes, in one way. If you say the thought of the sutra, Dodeki Gongba, Tang, Sungpa Gongba. Sungpa Gongba is the thought of the speaker. So now in the middle wheel, the Dodeke Gongba, Tang, Songbebe Gongba are the same. But on the literal reading, the Daisen is Daisen de Songbebe Gongba Mayin. Daisen de, that means the literal reading is not the thought of the speaker. Dayan, Dodeke Gongba Mayin. It's not the thought of the sutra either. Whereas in the first wheel, they're mutually exclusive. The first wheel. Sunrake Gongba, Tang, Sungbobe Gongba, Gyawa. And that's why it requires interpretation. But in the middle wheel, Sunrake Gongba, Tang, Sungbobe Gongba, Turnchik. So the way the middle wheel requires interpretation and the way the first wheel requires interpretation are very different.
Whose point of view is this?
So you can see why one of these people, Koramba Sunab Senge or Shakya Chokden, would have a category of Tangdun ki Ngedun. See, would make both the second wheel and the third wheel Ngedun. But within that, there are two types. One that requires a certain type of interpretation, this being a literal reading, but not what is actually expressed by the sutra. The thought of the sutra doesn't require it. See, the thought of the sutra is what Buddha is communicating to these sharp disciples. So it's his in this case, his thought and the thought of the sutra, of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, are the same. That being in full accordance with the third wheel. Now we're all speaking from the point of view of mind only. So you see, in mind only, within Gelu, the third wheel is definitive, but it's not the best of all sutras. Well, why do you have the third wheel? For those people who can't read the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and understand them as the three natures, Ngonyi Somta Ngonyi Merosum. Right? So, you can see that there's a concordance in Chittamatra Gelu between the middle wheel and the final wheel. Do you follow? Because even though the literal reading of the middle wheel requires interpretation, the thought of the sutra doesn't. So now, using words like intention as people do, that's, I don't use it because you have the purpose of the sutra. That's another category from the thought of the sutra and the thought of the speaker. Everybody translates purpose, thought, and thought as intention. You can't understand. So now in the first wheel, what's the thought of the sutra? Sutra on for instance, teaching the Four Noble Truths, etc.
All phenomena are established by their own characteristics.
Yeah, or worded either as Chotamche Rangit Sendiki Truba Yin or Chotamche Ranzadobi Shinji Rangit Sendiki Truba Yin. Either way, that's the thought of the sutra. What's the thought of the speaker? Kawakawa. No hope, right? So, thus, the gongshi, there's a gongshi to it, a basis in Buddha's thought, from which Buddha is speaking. The gongshi and the gongba are tunchi. Now,
what about emptiness of self?
Emptiness itself?
Of self, like the first world teaches the emptiness of self.
Yes, what about it?
Well, that's not, that's the beyond teaching that, wrong single vision, Hsüan
Within the Four Noble Truths, we can find a teaching of the Kansaki Dame. And as specified by the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, it teaches that the first wheel teaches that Kansaki Dame, runs the Vishinshi Rangitsini Trubayin. So then you have to step back and say, does the first wheel teach? Really difficult question, Kansaki Dame. Does it teach Midakpa? If it teaches Rangitseniki, Ransato Vishinshi Rangitseniki Trube Midakpa, or Ransato Vishinshi Rangitseniki Trube Kansaki Dame, right? Those don't exist. And so thus, could you, based on the first wheel, achieve, realization of Midakpa? Could you achieve Kansaki Dame? You have to say that they do, but that, and then you have to start cutting hairs, slicing. What is it called? Splitting hairs. Slicing.
Same thing.
That's a very difficult topic. It moves into very difficult territory. And that's really, I think, where you're coming from.
Where is this issue discussed, Jeffrey?
What issue?
Of what the first turning the wheel?
Well, number one, in Reflections on Reality, there's a short chapter. Chapter 9 of Reflections on Reality, it's about 11 pages. Can a wrong view relieve pain? And, if you look at it, the intuitive read is, oh yeah, Buddha teaches the wrong thing at times to help people do this and that. But there are a lot of issues involved. Then, what are we looking for again?
There's wheel turning.
Well, in the Blue Book, there's a long discussion of the phenomena that the Buddha refers to in the beginning of the translation. What phenomena one can apply the three natures to? And then it's a total breakdown of everything he says, like the 37 harmonies and
Everything can be.
Yeah.
Everything.
yeah.
And that was a problem you were having the other day, and wondering about the mind, how to posit three natures with respect to the mind.
Yeah.
If you don't come out of this class with knowing how to posit the three natures and the three non-natures with respect to each and every phenomena, you will have missed, the foundation. Okay? You get to the point where you'll just say them right away. You'll have no question. Then you move on to your to what you really want to talk about. But then you can put it in context that isn't confused, okay? You say, if the three natures with respect to the eye consciousness or mental consciousness are posited this way, then how do you perform the actual meditation, okay? Rather than getting stuck on how do you posit the three natures. Then, for next time, please read Chapter 12 of the translation, which is interpretation of Scripture. Because with all that we said about that today, it will, that'll serve as background for reading it. Okay? That's it.